Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Patty, how are you this week as the rain begins to fall?
Now, in beautiful, delightful Dublin, it is. I was going to say it in Irish, but I actually am confident enough that I can say that the sun is splitting the stones. I'm like on green eggs glitch. I don't even fucking remember. You probably do because you're from the fucking Gaeltacht. But anyway, the sun is splitting here. You know, it's absolutely shining, and it is very, very humid and very, very warm. Which I don't mind. I like fucking humid and I like warm, so it's all good by me. But it's not great when you have an office job basically where I sit in my room and my room is basically just completely south facing. So the sun beams into it and the room heats up to about 60 degrees Celsius. You know, it's not ideal, but we get it done. We're making fucking moves. How are you, Gary? How was your week? Is there anything going on in your life that the beautiful people that listen to us need to be aware of?
No.
That was fantastic. And that's the podcast, guys. So if you want to get in contact with us, no, okay, well, that was a terrible response. But anyway, look, we'll move on from that swiftly. So the podcast topic today is, as you've probably got from the tagline or whatever, is does what you eat matter, right? Is it all just calories, right? And obviously we're continuing on from the discussion of calories, this broader energy balance discussion that we've been having in relation to fat loss, right? And to basically make this an extremely short, very, 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 very short podcast topic, in terms of fat loss, right? If we're sticking purely to fat loss, does what you eat matter? To an extent, no, right? To a large extent, no, unfortunately, right? And I say unfortunately because there's a whole lot of other things that it does actually matter for that are related to fat loss, right? Namely, say, for example, like we want fat loss, right? If we are in a calorie deficit, yes, we are going to change our weight, right? Because remember, it's weight that is related to calories. It's not necessarily like fat or muscle or whatever. Like there is obviously a relationship there, but it's not a one-to-one like it is with weight, right? So it's weight that's related to calories. However, most people are not looking to just become smaller versions of themselves, right? Especially people that are listening to this, they want to be stronger, they want to be fitter, they want to be healthier, they want to build some muscle, so it's like the stuff that we do with the diet does actually influence all of those other things. So again, most people are not going to be like, oh, well, I'm 80 kilos now. I want to be 60 kilos, but I basically want to look the exact same, the same shape I have now. And I just want to be a smaller version of myself, most people don't want that when we're talking about fat loss. Most people want actual fat loss, which usually entails some degree of building some muscle, creating a certain look, a certain shape, a certain physique that we're looking for. And that's both men and women, regardless of who we're talking to. It's like they're looking for a certain look rather than just a certain scale weight. And you might use scale weight as a proxy, but anyone who actually chases scale weight quickly realizes that it doesn't actually give you what you want. It's a false god, if you will, right? So that's the important part of the discussion. Understanding that what you eat doesn't matter necessarily for manipulating your weight, right? But we're not doing a weight loss series. We're doing a fat loss series, right? So for fat loss, what you eat does matter a bit more, right? And this is something that you need to be aware of. Is that true in your mind, Gary? Is it, just from an energy perspective and, looking at weight, would you be like, right, it actually kind of doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't really matter what you eat. It's just eat whatever, hit your calories, boom, we're done. But if we're talking about fat loss, like we're trying to preferentially get fat loss, does what you eat actually matter, right? And before that, obviously, look, we're going to caveat this and say, and we will touch on it later on, there are obviously, we always say there's basically three outcomes you can look for when you're looking at all of this stuff. It's like you've got health, you've got body composition, and you've got performance, right? Right now, we're just talking about the body composition stuff. Later on, we'll talk about performance a bit and we'll talk about the health aspects. But just from a body composition standpoint, zeroing in on manipulating weight and then zeroing in on manipulating fat mass. What are you thinking, Gary? Does what you eat actually matter?
Yes. So when it comes to changes in weight, as you said, it's going to be primarily determined, at least beyond like very short-term periods of time, on your caloric intake. Okay. So the overall energy content of the diet. And this is the case relatively independent of the specific macronutrients that have been consumed. So obviously there's a contribution of different foods to the thermic effect of feeding, which you'll already know if you've been listening to the last few episodes. But that's kind of where we transition from also discussing weight loss versus fat loss, as you said. So you could absolutely eat cereal 4 times a day, and if you're in a calorie deficit, you'll begin to lose weight. Okay, even if it's a sugary cereal or it's sweets or it's chocolate or ice cream or whatever you'd like to choose.
Insert whatever banned foods.
Yeah, it literally doesn't matter anything. Okay, once you're in that deficit of energy. However, when we look to when we look at changes in weight, that could be the result of changes in fat mass, of course, but it could also be the result of loss of muscle mass, which is something we definitely don't want when trying to pursue fat loss for multiple reasons beyond just the aesthetic, okay? Because muscle preserves health, muscle preserves performance, and muscle also preserves weight loss maintenance. So when you're thinking about fat loss, then obviously macronutrients become a little bit more important, and particularly the one that stands out as being most important there would be protein. Where if you have a low protein intake while in a calorie deficit, you are adding one catabolic signal to another catabolic signal. So you're increasing the chances of muscle loss, and therefore you could lose, let's say, a certain amount of fat mass, but you've also lost a certain amount of muscle mass. And the aesthetic appearance might be that you haven't lost any body fat at all because you've taken out some of the solid structure underneath that body fat, and your relative body fat percentage might still be the same or even have increased as a result of muscle loss. And obviously it's far more of a concern for people who don't train at all, because that anabolic signal that training provides is not there at all. So that is one of the reasons that we would always encourage people who are trying to lose weight to train, to try to build muscle. Even if they don't want to, it will maintain what they have. And that's something that's really important.
And this is something that you might not think is an actual issue in terms of like you might be listening to this, you've just stumbled across and you're like, oh, it's fat loss. I'm just looking for the answer for like, does what I eat matter? Like it actually does. Like I couldn't tell you the amount of people, especially when I work with people in person, like the amount of people that would come up to you and be like, right, oh, I've tried fat loss diets before. I've tried like, dieting before. And all that happened was, again, I became a smaller version of myself. I didn't actually get the look or, the type of physique that I wanted, it's like, yeah, again, you might have been following this calorie controlled diet and you might have lost weight on it. But again, if you're not actually providing the inputs that lead to what we want, which is, again, like in this context, it's an aesthetic, a look, a physique, an image, whatever. It's like, if you're not actually providing all of the inputs to reach that, of course you're not going to reach that, so why did you expect that, right? But again, people just don't know that there are other inputs, such as resistance training, again, such as building some muscle in some key areas, such as retaining muscle. Like there is a lot going into this beyond just managing calories, so that is something that, again, you need to be aware of, right? And to really start off this discussion, unless you have anything else to say, Gary.
No, that's good.
So to really start off this discussion, like let's lay all the cards on the table, right? So there's a few things. Again, remember, we're talking about body composition change here now, right? There is a concept for dieting called IIFYM, right? If it fits your macros, right? And this would postulate, and this is where a lot of the, we'll call it, issues arise, where people use that concept of IIFYM, right? And they're talking about, does what you eat matter, in the concept of someone that's tracking their calories and macros, right? Now, if we're talking about someone who's only tracking their calories, it's less, or I should say, it's more of a concern what you eat, right? Because first of all, again, hunger is a thing. We need to actually be satiated from the diet that we eat, etc. There's a whole host of other things that go into that. But also, like, if you're not actually actively tracking the macronutrients as well, even if it's just protein, like you're just tracking calories and protein, that's a huge benefit for actually, manipulating your health, huge benefit for manipulating your body composition, your performance, etc. Right? So this is where a lot of the disconnect comes from, because people will be doing like IFYM and they'll be like, all right, what I eat doesn't actually matter, but they're saying that in the context of eating a macronutrient balanced and calorie balanced diet, right? So that's the context you have to realize going into this discussion, that these people are actually micromanaging the minutia in terms of, well, the macronutia, the macros. They're micromanaging that stuff. So you have to be aware of that going into the discussion, right? Because if you said to someone in the real world, oh, what you eat doesn't matter, you can eat whatever the fuck you want, as long as you stay within your calories, like that's not actually likely to produce the results that you want, right? For body composition, health, performance, whatever, right? So you already have to peel back that layer in terms of understanding what people are actually doing in the real world versus what people are doing in this niche of like the health and fitness world, where people count calories and macros, etc. So do you have anything to say on that, Gary, in terms of like this whole IIFYM, like where that fits in the bigger picture? Because I know a lot of practitioners who, or I should say IIFYM practitioners, if I could actually finish my thoughts, would be like, oh, calories don't matter, just hit your macros, hit your calories, right? But that's already going above and beyond what a lot of people are doing in terms of the real world. So what are your thoughts on that while I close this window?
Yeah, so I mean, like the thing to understand is that when most people in the general population are starting the process of trying to lose body weight or fat, they're going to start by trying to make some qualitative changes to the foods that they're consuming. This typically involves people, cutting out the chocolate in the evening, cutting out the crisps, maybe stopping drinking sugar sweetened beverages, etc. And like that's a really important thing to try and grasp, is where people are actually at the beginning. And very often what can happen is that people might just cut out some of these foods and they increase their vegetable intake or whatever. And the result of that modification of food quality is that they end up feeling fuller, they end up feeling more energetic. They don't have the same cravings or tendency to overeat. And as a result, they begin to lose weight. So despite the fact that they haven't tracked anything, the qualitative changes in terms of the satiety value of the meals and the likelihood for overconsumption, that facilitates them losing weight. No calorie tracking required. Okay, so this is something that's important to get, because that's actually a relatively easy change, for people. And calorie tracking itself can be very easy for some people, but for others, it mightn't be something that is sustainable for them. It mightn't be something that they're open to at this point in time. It might be a literacy issue, particularly a digital literacy issue, in terms of if you're advising someone who maybe isn't so savvy with smartphones, like an elderly individual. If they make the qualitative changes to their diet without having to go through all these steps of weighing and tracking, etc., that's a very positive thing. So the if it fits your macros approach, it sort of assumes a certain amount of knowledge already, and that's what you generally see from individuals who do track their calories and kind of eat whatever they want, is that they're already very savvy with calorie tracking. They already know how to get in their protein. They already know how to get in their fiber, and they'll be selecting specific foods to try to hit those things potentially. Whereas the beginner who's just starting to improve their nutrition, they've never gone through that phase of just changing their diet qualitatively, trying to eat more vegetables, trying to figure out where to get protein in the diet, where do I get fiber, where do I get carbohydrates. And I think if someone can get that down first and foremost, or as part of the calorie tracking process, that's far superior to just giving someone numbers and saying eat whatever you want. Because I think we need some structure and some rigidity before we can kind of reach this ultimate flexible idea.
Yeah, and this is unfortunate again, because like if you're trying to educate people, like you're a content creator or just even like just someone on social media that's like, oh, I want people to eat better, and you're advising them to do like an IIFYM approach, and it's like, yeah, you have to remember where you started. And like we use like an IIFYM, like, or a macro approach or whatever, calories, macros, we assign those kind of things for a lot of our clients. Obviously depends on the population, depends on what they're coming to us for, etc. but we use it as a teaching tool. It's like, this is the first intervention, or maybe not the first, it depends, and this is an intervention we're using to educate you about the diet so that you can make better choices with the diet, right? Well, it's a tool to make better choices, which implies that the choices you make with the diet do actually matter, right? Because that's what we're aiming towards. We're aiming to improve that, right? So that is something to be aware of. It shouldn't just be a case of like, oh, I learned how to count calories and macros, and like that's the end of my nutritional education, and that's a lot of people find themselves in that boat, right? And this is why, like, there's probably studies on this, but in my limited knowledge, and most people that practice like IIFYM have the shittest relationship with food. Like the vast majority of them have dietary practices that are extremely poor. Of like on any, like you go to, like there's obviously like binge eating and disordered eating metrics and whatever, and you look at them, you're like, this is the stuff that you're talking about that these individuals have, and the stuff that people that practice IFYM talk about. It's, I don't know where that cut out, but anyway, I will edit this later on. What I was saying is that people that practice an IFYM approach generally have far too much overlap in terms of their thoughts, in terms of their dietary practices, with people who actually have like disordered eating patterns, that actually have disordered eating thoughts, that have disordered eating, approach to the diet overall. So it's like, this maybe isn't the best approach long term for everyone. Now, some people, again, it depends on the way you do it. Like most things, it's like, like a gun isn't dangerous. It depends on how you use the fucking gun. Like, obviously, it's like, it's just a tool, right? Tools aren't inherently dangerous. It's the person using the tool or the way they are using the tool, right? So that is something to be aware of, that unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that people put out with IFYM is actually just really, really bad advice in terms of like having a good relationship with food. And that's because they actually don't think that diet quality matters right now. And obviously that's not all of them. We're tying with the same brush. Like I track my calories and macros. So technically I would be considered someone who practices IFYM. So I'm in the same category, right? But as I was saying, a lot of them just have a really, really poor relationship with food, with the diet overall. And that is probably a result of, first of all, a bit of a selection bias in terms of like, who goes and tracks calories and is real anal with their diet. It's probably people that already have some disordered eating thoughts or whatever. And then also it's like this method of manipulating the diet probably causes some sort of disordered eating thoughts along the way as well, right? But bringing it back to the actual question, a lot of these individuals will be like, right, oh yeah, what you eat doesn't matter. However, again, it's in the context that they're already tracking all their calories and macros, so it matters less, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? And this is why I was talking about them having a shit relationship with food, because most of them would not be able to actually regulate their intake if MyFitnessPal was just to fucking break, like wherever MyFitnessPal has their central hub, where they keep all their data, where they do whatever, where they have their servers or whatever, right? If that was to just get nuked, right, it's just gone, right? All of these people in the fitness industry, they're like, oh yeah, I'm really good with my diet, blah, blah, blah. I know how to manage my cravings. I know how to do this. Like they're all fucked. Like they actually haven't built up good diet patterns. They haven't built something that is, strong, resilient. They haven't built something that they're going to be able to do into their 70s, 80s, 90s. It's just, oh, I eat according to an app. I don't know about internal hunger signals. I don't know how to actually eat quality foods so that I feel full, so that I'm, energetic throughout the day, etc. Right? They're just like, oh, whatever numbers I have left, I just hit those. It's like, this is probably a poor relationship with food. It's not a resilient approach. Like what happens when you go traveling, and then again, you see what happens when all these people that do purely like an IFYM approach go traveling, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden you're like, your diet turns to fucking muck because you don't actually have any good diet skills. You just know how to input data and stick to within a certain amount of calories and macros, right? So what you eat does matter. It matters less if you're tracking it like really anally. You're just like every single thing you're like, oh, I have to do this. But even then, it's like it still matters. You're just trying to bypass how much it matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the difference really between explicit and implicit caloric restriction, because all you're doing when you track calories is you're explicitly restricting your calories. You're explicitly saying, this is where I'm going to stop. So you have some sort of rigidity, whether you like it or not, because you have rigidity in those targets. Like, yes, you can be flexible with the types of foods that you're consuming, but you're also saying, I need to hit these specific targets. And as a result, any consideration of hunger cues often goes out the window. The implicit version of that then is that, all right, you're not explicitly setting a calorie target, but you're implicitly restricting your calories through the act of selecting certain foods over others. For example, eating chicken breast and boiled potato and broccoli versus eating, I don't know, a really tasty southern fried chicken stir fry type of dish. You're going to be able to eat a lot more of the latter, regardless of how much you're measuring of the two, because that's more palatable. So you're making this conscious choice to choose the version that, it might still be tasty, but it's not hyper palatable. And there's going to be implicit caloric restriction that results from that, because you know that that's going to allow you to feel more full and for there to be a less of a tendency to overeat. So there's implicit caloric restriction there. There's more flexibility in that, because in one domain, because the person has the ability to decide when they stop. Okay, so they might reach a certain point and say, yeah, I think I'm full enough after that. I don't think I need dessert. But they might have more rigidity then in terms of the specific food choices. So in one version, you're restricting the overall calories and you're rigid in terms of the calorie level that you achieve. And in the other version, you're maybe a little bit more restrictive with food choices, but you have a bit more freedom with exactly how much you consume. They're both means of restricting calories if they are contributing to a calorie deficit and thus weight loss. But it's different tools for different jobs, and they both ultimately serve a similar purpose.
100%. And again, I think anyone who actually has ever dieted or any would have managed their nutrition, they will notice the differences in terms of, I eat certain foods and they seem to keep me fuller for longer. I eat certain foods and I seem to be hungry, straight afterwards, or I just want more of that food or whatever, right? So again, you can just you can notice this yourself, that this does clearly play a role, right? And again, you are basically bypassing it by doing this IIFYM stuff, But even if you do IFYM and you hit your macros, you probably had days where you're like, oh yeah, I feel really full, feel great on this diet, feel energetic, etc. And you've had days where you're like, I've actually prioritized, less palatable or more palatable foods, less satiating foods, and all of a sudden I'm hungry, I don't feel great on this diet, I'm tired, I don't have energy, etc. Right? So that is important to know, right? And one of the key things with all of this stuff, especially as it relates to does what you eat matter, is we have to talk about protein, right? Because protein, as we mentioned earlier on, is it's one of the pretty big things in terms of what you actually eat and the results that you get, right? Because as we said earlier on, it is one of the things that helps you retain / build muscle, right? So again, we're trying to look for, in this conversation anyway, we're trying to look for a certain physique that we're looking towards, or a certain aesthetic, whatever image. So we want to manipulate that, and one of the ways we do that is with the use of protein, right? The intake of protein. Now, obviously, it does have health impacts in terms of positive health impacts. I don't mean negative ones, right? Obviously, it contributes to better health, especially longer health in terms of, you build more muscle. All of a sudden, you're living to 90 years old because you actually can get up from a fall. You can survive a fall. You can actually still be mobile into your 90s, etc. Right? So protein is really important. And as a result, if protein is important, what you eat does actually matter, right? So it's not just calories. It's not just the energy balance of the diet. The foods you consume on that diet clearly play a role, right? So with protein, we want to have that again, it depends on the population, but as that really rough and ready rule, a gram per pound is just a fucking generic. But the one I always say for people that feel I don't know how much muscle I have or what my goals are or whatever, I'm like, whatever your height is in centimeters, that's the amount of protein that you should be eating. Again, rough and ready, that's not going to be for everyone. Obviously, if you're not resistance training, you are doing excessive resistance training, you are doing sports on top of that, it's all going to modify that number. But as a rough and ready rule, I like to, what's your height, and use that, or your height in centimeters, and use that number. Now, obviously, look, if you are absolutely jacked out of your mind, you know, like say I'm 195, 196 centimeters, right? Imagine that I was actually like 120, 130 kilos of muscle. Like, obviously, that's not going to work for me, that number, right? I'm going to have to use my weight. However, most people that are natural, because I'm, you know, it would just not be natural if I was 120 or 130 kilos of muscle, right? Most people are natural. That number is going to work for them in terms of like their centimeters, their height in centimeters, you know. But you have anything to say on protein, Gary?
I suppose one thing to consider on the protein front, obviously, quantity you've discussed, clearly important, but quality is also something that does come into this. I was just discussing it with a client yesterday, where he's a new client actually, and he was a vegan for I think 5 years, and is now kind of pushing back to vegetarianism, and obviously in those cases protein quality becomes important. Now, how important that is does somewhat depend on overall protein quantity, because generally if you get up to the levels that we generally recommend, let's say 2 grams or more kilos, or 2 grams 2 grams or more of protein per kilo of body weight, like you're probably fine even if it's from plant-based sources, or a large proportion of it from plant-based sources. But you do obviously sacrifice, depending on the specific plant-based source, you sacrifice leucine content and branched chain amino acid content often, and that can potentially lead to less of a muscle building effect or muscle retentive effect at a given level of protein. So yeah, it's just one of those things that obviously, again, what you eat matters, and getting more animal protein or protein from animal sources is something that is beneficial. But if you are on a plant-based diet, that you're at least seeking out maybe some sort of plant-based protein source, looking at the amino acid content, or that you're just conscious of getting your protein sources in at each meal you consume.
Yeah, and also another point, just to, you know, on the back end of that as well, it's like it clearly is important beyond just looking at the protein, because a lot of, say, you know, plant-based proteins, like you're getting other stuff along with that. And it's the same with meat as well. Like, you know, I was gonna say meat-based proteins, but like just meat in general. And like the protein you get, yeah, that's one thing, but you also get fats with it. You know, in you know, the carnivore type diet or omnivore type diet, it's like the protein source generally comes along with something like fats. And it's the same with a vegan or vegetarian diet. It's like, oh, the protein source that you're eating also comes along with carbohydrates, comes along with fats. And this is obviously something that you have to factor in, right? Because if you're trying to stay within your calories and the only protein sources you have available to you are, you know, super high calorie, you know, accessory calories, if you will, like they're coming along with a load of carbohydrates, or they're coming along with a load of, you know, fats or something, it's like it's going to be harder for you to manage your calorie number while also hitting this protein number, right? So again, indicates that the foods you eat matter, you know, so it is something to be aware of, right? And then above and beyond that, and this is probably more important, although we don't actually think of it in, at least in the Western world or the developed world. I don't know which one is worse to say these days. Apparently, you're not supposed to say either of those things. I don't know what we're supposed to refer to it as, but you know what I'm talking about. The world that we live in. If you're listening to this, most of you live in this world, you know. Micronutrients, right? These are clearly, like, you need to get your micronutrients in, right? Because like you can get a whole host of diseases if you don't, right? And like you might not think of this, but like it's literally only within the last 100 years, you know, that we haven't had all of these other diseases that are associated with micronutrient deficiencies. And like you still see it occasionally, like, you know, people will develop rickets, especially like, you know, children that are abused or something, like they'll get like rickets, I should say, and from like vitamin D deficiency and stuff like that. Like you will see it occasionally. And for example, like a lot of, there's a study that shows that like whatever it is, like I think it was 10% of students have like subclinical scurvy. You know, they're literally just below that level of having scurvy. And if you remember back from your like your history in your like, you know, teen years, like scurvy was a disease that like, you know, they used to say like sailors and pirates and stuff used to get because they weren't getting like vitamin C in their diets, right? And obviously that was cured or fixed by citrus fruits and stuff. But a lot of like, especially students, they don't eat vegetables, they don't eat fruits, they don't eat anything that has any vitamin C in it, right? So they're in this
deficient state from vitamin C, right? And that again comes with scurvy. And then like, oh, I wonder why every time I brush my teeth, there's blood everywhere. It's like, all right, well, you've got fucking scurvy, mate. You need some help here, right? But again, we don't often think about this because we live in a world of abundance and we've already kind of eradicated all of these issues. But micronutrients are clearly important, not just for preventing disease, but also for actually creating optimal function within the body, right? For actually getting the results that you want in terms of body composition. Yeah, for sure. Again, that's what the topic of conversation is here, but especially in terms of health and performance, right? You're not getting enough of the micronutrients that you need. You're not going to have good health. You're not going to have good performance. You're not going to have good body composition, because you might not think you're like, oh, how does that influence body composition? But you're like, oh, I have absolutely no energy because you're iron deficient. Like, you're not fucking burning off extra calories through meat. You're not training hard because through that eat burning, because you don't have any fucking energy. You don't have enough iron. So it's like micronutrients are clearly important, and it's not just good enough to be like, oh yeah, well, I'll just have a multivitamin and that'll cover me. It's like that is the most ludicrous statement to ever make, because it actually doesn't actually fix the issue, because it's like, okay, cool, again, like all we've done now is bring in a multivitamin that potentially helps with certain things, but you're not actually getting all the stuff that you need potentially, because this multivitamin is trying to pack in as much of the beneficial stuff as it can, but it doesn't mean that it gets them all in the best quantities or the best forms or whatever that an actually well planned out diet could get, right? And especially if a varied diet. And also, we don't know all the stuff that's in food. You think that we do, but we don't. There's other stuff in it like phytonutrients, different bioactive compounds, even stuff like micro RNA, which is obviously topical. Whenever you mention RNA, people are like, oh, vaccines, like, bro, you've been eating RNA the whole fucking time, because you eat it through food, right? So like all this stuff, it is important to understand that there is more in your food than just the macronutrients. And a lot of people, especially people that again do this kind of IIFYM style diet, they actually are micronutrient deficient, even though they're like, oh, well, I have my multivitamin. It's like, yeah, well, you actually have a severe lack of stomach acid because you don't get enough zinc, because your protein intake has been, poor, or you're like, I don't know, fucking different things, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my stomach acid doesn't actually fucking secrete the way I want it to, and now all of a sudden you're not actually absorbing nutrients elsewhere. And it's like, it clearly fucking matters what you eat, because it influences all that stuff, which we'll touch on later on again. But do you have anything to say about micronutrients?
No, I agree with everything you said. I mean, it's a fairly simple case. I think most people actually generally tend to be aware of this, that consuming more fruits, vegetables, lean meats, etc., that they tend to be nutrient dense sources of food, and that as a result, if you're trying to improve your nutrient status, that you try to eat plenty of colorful foods, you try to eat nutrient dense foods. I think people are probably aware of that, and I would be in agreement with everything you said.
Fantastic. And then just obviously as it relates to body composition, because again, we're talking about fat loss here, remember, stuff like sodium and potassium, like electrolytes, these clearly play a role in terms of body composition. Like if you're always going like, oh, I'm always so watery, I always feel like bloated or whatever, like, well, bloating is a different issue, not entirely, but whatever, right? You're always like, oh, I feel real watery, and I can't get a pump in the gym, blah, 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 right? There could be issues going on in terms of like your electrolyte balance overall. So again, that's influenced by what you eat. And this is especially true of people who eat a Western diet that's just usually typically very high in sodium, right? And like, I hate these arguments generally, but like ancestrally, like, we didn't consume a huge amount of sodium, right? Like our need for sodium is quite low in comparison to other things. Although we do have a very good detection method in terms of like, we can taste, like we kind of like, oh, I need something salty. Like your body will signal, like, how like your body signals hunger, and you're like, if you're trying to describe what hunger is, it's hard to describe it. Like your body will also signal that, oh, I need salt. And like, you will get like salt cravings. You'll be like, oh, I want some salty food, right? Like your body is able to sense that. However, traditionally, like ancestrally, like we wouldn't have ever had a need to develop those senses for something like potassium, right? So this is why people like, it's a stupid argument where people say like, oh, like your body will tell you what it needs, right? Your body's never going to tell you that you are potassium deficient. It's never going to do it. It doesn't have a mechanism of telling you, right? Like if your body is sodium deficient, it'll be like, you'll start having cravings for salty foods, right? Because traditionally, again, if that was the case, like ancestrally, you would have gone to a fucking salt lick. That's what, prey animals do. They would have gone to a salt lick, lick some fucking rocks that are salty. Or in our case, maybe we'd gone to fucking saltwater fish or something, got something salty. We would have found a way to do it, right? Because again, we would have been like, oh, we need some sodium, right? But ancestrally, we would have eaten a high potassium diet, right? You think about like tubers, like potatoes and stuff, which is like the vast majority of humans, we ancestrally like grew up or evolved eating stuff like tubers, which are fucking packed full of potassium, right? Vegetables, again, packed full of potassium, right? So like we don't have a method of detecting when potassium is low because we've never needed one, because our diet has always traditionally been packed full of potassium, right? Like we need something like 15 grams of potassium per day, right? The fucking WHO, all these health organizations are like, do not eat more than 5 grams of sodium per day. It's bad for your health, right? Like 15 grams versus 5 grams. I'm like, there's a fucking huge difference here, right? But most people, if you have eat a shit diet, you don't, like, you literally eat like, I don't know, whatever, bread and whey protein or something, like you probably fucking end up deficient in potassium pretty fucking quick, and this has implications for, first of all, the way your body looks, the way your body performs, and obviously health, especially related to like stuff like blood pressure. You're like, oh, why is my blood pressure so terrible, even though I've been tracking my calories, even though I've been like eating these certain macros? It's like, yeah, you're just actually deficient in a load of fucking micronutrients, and your actual diet model is terrible, right? And again, it's something that can be hard to actually interpret, especially if you don't have an understanding of all the complexities of a diet. But it's like, listen to what other people say. It's like, eat fruit and vegetables, eat lean meats. It's like, there's your foundation of your diet. There's a reason why pretty much everyone agrees that that's the foundation of the diet, because that gets the stuff that you need, right? Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No, that's all good.
Further to that then is fiber. Like this is like, we need fiber. Well, this is technically not true. You don't actually need fiber. However, it does provide a very fundamental role in human physiology in terms of helping us poop, but also in terms of like doing stuff like bile acid sequestration. That's how you say that word, isn't it? And like getting bile out of the body, helping to reduce cholesterol, etc. This is also one of those things where it's real funny when you see like people talk about like ancestral diets, and they're like, oh, well, we eat these ancestral diets and they had way more like animal produce and whatever. It's like, yeah, they probably also had like 150 grams of fiber per day, so like their cholesterol would have been fucking looked after because of that, as well as the fact that they probably had copious amounts of infections and parasites, which also tend to lower your cholesterol, or even we should say like having higher cholesterol in those situations is potentially beneficial, right? But that's another story for another day, right? But in this context, fiber is beneficial for your diet, right? It's very beneficial for helping with your body composition change, because it's going to keep you fuller for longer. So you're actually able to stick to your diet, able to stick to the calories, the macros, etc., that you want to be on. I couldn't tell you the amount of people that have come to us and said like, oh yeah, like I'm hitting my calories and macros, but I'm always hungry. Like you've definitely seen this, Gary. You've definitely had clients say this. I'm like, oh, I'm just very hungry on this. I'm like, okay, let's see, what are you eating here? And you're like, there's absolutely no vegetables here. It's like you had a slice of tomato. That was your only exposure. And you had tomato ketchup. It's like, there's your exposure to vegetables. Tomato is probably a fucking fruit anyway. I actually think it is, but anyway, that's beside the point. You know what I mean? It's like these people are just not eating vegetables, fruits and vegetables. And as a result, it's like you're not getting a lot of fiber in your diet. And as a result of that, you're obviously going to be very hungry all the time. Like while protein is satiating, like fiber is fucking super satiating. If you get that combo of protein and fiber, all of a sudden you're like, I actually really don't want to eat anymore. Like I had one client that were like, oh, like I'm really hungry all the time. And I just want to, I still want to diet, but I'm very hungry. And I'm like, okay, look, we're going to make some swaps here. And all we did was swap out, like they're having some bagels, right? They're like, all right, I have these regular bagels. We just swapped out to like high fiber bagels. And all of a sudden they were like, oh man, I feel great. You know, I'm stuffed now for the next 3-4 hours. You know, it's like, this is a simple swap, you know, like very simple, but it indicates that clearly what you eat matters, you know? And we could argue, it's like, oh, well, you know, like the calories and the macros, et cetera, stayed the same. But like, I would argue that fiber is a macro, so they technically didn't. But it is one of those things where it's like what you eat clearly matters. So it's not just like, oh, stay within your calories and hit your macros. You know, it's there's a little bit more to it. Fiber is very, very beneficial. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No. Eat your fiber.
This is you all the time. You literally just be like, yeah, no, nothing to say. The next thing, right? The next thing is kind of fatty acids. Like fatty acids are clearly important. The first one being omega-3s, right? Like again, you need these in your diet. We cannot create them ourselves. Well, that's not technically true. There are other omega-3s that you can. But anyway, that's beside the point. Like the essential fatty acids in our context, DHA, EPA, you need to get them from the diet. You can't make them yourself, right? And they're vital for brain development. Like if you think you're stupid, right, and you're not eating fish, you probably are stupid. Like if you're like, I'm not happy with the intelligence level that I have, and you're not eating fish, and like, yeah, unfortunately, I have to confirm that you are not intelligent. So like they are really beneficial from a brain health perspective. They are really beneficial from, you know, a whole host of other benefits in terms of like insulin sensitivity, in terms of like, you know, cell membranes and cell fluidity, etc. Like that. Like you literally just type in omega-3, whatever disease, whatever pathology you want, you'll find papers showing that omega-3s are beneficial. You know, like I'm not even joking when I say that. Like that's pretty much the case. They're universally beneficial, right? So we need to eat omega-3s in the diet, and again, that indicates that what you consume matters. It's not just calories. You know, you can't just be like, oh, I hit my fat macros and I hit my calories as a result of that. It's all good. It's like, no, the quality of the food that you eat in terms of like the fatty acid composition clearly matters, right? Also related to that, in terms of we're talking about fats, saturated fat, right? If you're just like, oh, I have 60 grams of fat to eat, and you eat 60 grams of saturated fat, like that is not the same as eating like 60 grams of monounsaturated fat, you know, or polyunsaturated fat. Like they're going to lead to different outcomes in terms of body composition. Yeah, 100%, right? In terms of like, where do the fatty acids come from that are on your body, right? Or in your body, I should say, in terms of like the fatty acid stores, right? They come from the diet that you eat, right? So you potentially do have a more tightly packed, more thicker packed, like body fat if you consume fatty acids that are mainly saturated fat, right? Now, this is not 100%. There's a little bit more nuance to it, but it is something that you do notice, especially if you have someone who has traditionally eaten like a very like hydrogenated fat type diet or trans fatty acid type diet. You know, like you can feel that in their skin in terms of like if you ever have someone who like, you know, regularly monitors body fat, like they use like a calipers and they're literally touching people's fat all the time, like they'll be able to tell you how the composition of the diet affects like the actual feeling of that fat. Like you can feel the difference, right? Unsaturated fats also do that, because again, we're talking about body composition here. We're talking about how the body, you know, looks, whatever, right? Obviously relates to health. We've done a whole podcast series on like cardiovascular health. That is something that you should pay attention to as well. But just in terms of a fat loss context as well, if you have a diet that is, you know, higher in saturated fats, like those saturated fats are, as far as I'm aware, harder to kind of liberate from fat stores. So it actually makes fat loss a little bit harder if you have had a diet that is more fatty acids have come from saturated fat. And this, I would theorize, I haven't actually read a huge amount about it, but I would theorize that this is purely due to like, you know, stereochemistry, in terms of like these saturated fats are much easier to actually, you know, store together, because they don't have any like kinks in them, like these double bonds and stuff. So they're much easier to store together. And as a result, if you're able to pack things in nice and tight, like they don't come out as easily, right? And that's not, again, like that's basically kind of anthropomorphizing, you know, biochemical events. But that is my thought process on that anyway, right? Do you have anything else to say on omega-3s or saturated fats as it relates to, you know, does what you eat matter? No, I have nothing to say.
No, it doesn't matter. No, I mean, like it is very clearly the case that these things matter. Like the type of fat in the diet is very influential for a number of diseases, most notably very often cardiovascular disease is the one that comes up. If you're eating a diet that's very rich in saturated fat, you are increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. Probably some contribution to things like fatty liver and other diseases as well, but cardiovascular disease is the big one that people think of. So yeah, trying to consume a diet that is richer in unsaturated fat, and particularly trying to get in your omega-3s, whether that be directly through fish consumption in the diet or through omega-3 supplementation, especially if you're someone who is on a plant-based diet, it would be wise to do so. So yeah, that's important. I agree.
100%. Just eat those sea plants. That's what we need to do.
Yep.
The next thing then, again, digestive health clearly matters. Like what you eat clearly matters for your digestion, right? In terms of how your digestion functions, first of all, but also like if you're like you can't say that what I eat doesn't matter as long as I hit my calories. If every time you eat like milk or something, you're like, oh yeah, man, I basically shit my brains out. I feel digestive upset. I don't feel good. It's like clearly what you eat matters. It clearly matters to you, right? And obviously that's not the case for everyone, but everyone will notice that there are certain foods that they react better to or react worse to in terms of digestive health, right? So it clearly matters. What you eat clearly matters in terms of digestive health, right? And obviously we're not going to dive in deep on that because that is a whole other topic in and of itself. But I think anyone with two brain cells to rub together would be able to see that digestive health is influenced by what you eat. For some people more so than others, but most people are going to be able to say, oh yeah, actually that makes a lot of sense, right? And related to that is inflammation. Some foods just seem to cause some people more inflammation than others, right? And that could be because they're somewhat allergic to them. That could be because, again, they have digestive issues as a result of them. It could be because, I don't know, like some of those proteins that they're eating are able to get into circulation, and they cause like some sort of like kind of semi-autoimmune type reaction, or I shouldn't say autoimmune, I should say some sort of immune type reaction. Like people have like, I don't know, they get gluten sensitivities or something like that. It's like, okay, well, like your actual like gut lining is clearly not in a good place. So like we shouldn't be getting these intact proteins into the bloodstream. So something's going on here. And if that is you, if that is an issue for you, again, it makes sense that what you eat, you need to monitor what you eat. If you have trouble like pooping regularly, like again, what you eat matters. Are you getting enough fiber? Are you getting enough water? Are you chewing your food? Like there's so much that goes into it, right? And again, if you're having like bloating, distension, all that kind of stuff, what you eat clearly matters, right? It's not just a case of like, oh, I can eat anything, and as long as I hit my calories and macros, it's fine. That's not the case. If for half the day you have a food baby and you feel like crap, you can't move, again, all of a sudden now your NEAT goes down, your exercise activity goes down. Like it does have implications in terms of how you actually live your life. And obviously we're talking more so with body composition here, but obviously that has implications in terms of your health and your performance day to day. Like no one performs at their best if they feel bloated, distended, they feel like crap, they're literally fucking like all they want to do is curl up into a ball on this fucking floor. It's like you're not presenting your best self to the world when you're like that, right? So I don't have much else to say on that. I only have one final thing to kind of wrap it up. But do you have anything else that you'd like to make a note of, Gary, that would influence or that would make people or remind people, I suppose, that what you eat does actually matter?
Yeah, I suppose like one thing to keep in mind is that especially as you move to the domain of thinking about health, a lot of the effects of nutrition on health are cumulative over the long term, and therefore you might notice a difference in how you feel on a diet that we might consider to be of lower quality, but that difference could accumulate to something meaningful then over time, whether it be earlier neurodegenerative disease than would have been the case if you had a diet richer in polyphenols, for example. Or it could be that over time you don't have the same level of brain development because you don't have omega-3 in the diet. Again, these aren't things that you notice straight away. You can't feel atherosclerosis accumulating if you got a high saturated fat diet, but long term these things can then become clinically or personally significant. So I would just ask you to remind yourself that when you are thinking about your diet, and that you analyze it objectively with the future in mind rather than subjectively with how you feel in the moment in mind. Because while some instances of eating a crap diet can make you feel pretty crap in the short term, particularly as you were just saying, if it impacts your digestive health, some instances mightn't affect your perceived well-being all that much in the short term, but might affect your health meaningfully in the long term. And obviously, when you think of long-term health, it can then go on to impact body composition in the long term as well if you do end up unwell in any way. So yeah, just keep that long-term perspective in mind.
100%. So to kind of wrap it up, like, well, two things. First of all, like if you are concerned about any of the things, you're like, oh, I don't know how my vitamin D status is, or I don't know about how my diet is affecting my cholesterol or my habits or my exercise patterns or whatever. Like a lot of this stuff can be tested. Like if you're just like, oh, I don't know if my micronutrient status is up to scratch, and like you can get testing for that. Like go to your doctor, tell them your concerns. They might be like, look, you don't need to be concerned about this. It's like you're in a good position, right? You don't have any symptoms, blah blah blah, right? And you might go to a diet. They might refer you to a dietitian. You might analyze your diet and be like, yeah, actually no, you're actually good to go. But you can get testing for a lot of this stuff. You can get testing from like direct to consumer testing. If you're like, right, I want to take my health into my own hands and I want to look after this stuff, like you can do that. Like there's different companies out there that do testing, right? Obviously, again, you can go to your doctor, and that would be our general recommendation because they're supposed to be the one that's looking after your health. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that this doesn't mean that you have to be perfect with the diet all the time, right? So clearly what you eat does matter, right? It's not just all calories, it's not just all calories, and it's not just all calories and macros, right? What you eat does clearly influence a lot of things in terms of fat loss, in terms of body composition, in terms of weight loss, in terms of etc. Right? And obviously, again, it's not the topic of this conversation, but it impacts on health and it impacts on performance, all that kind of stuff, right? But even though it does matter for that stuff, it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect all the time. Like we always recommend like this kind of 80-20 or 90-10 rule in terms of like, okay, you don't have to be perfect all the time, but about 80% of the time, we want to be on point with our nutrition. You allow for 20% of the time to have the little, discretions, a little bit of like, oh, I have a bit of foods that I want that I know I don't react as, beneficially to you. I know they give me a little bit of upset, or, they're not the best in terms of micronutrients, or maybe it's a higher sodium food, or, this doesn't really have fiber and I normally like to get some fiber in at this meal, or, there's no omega-3s in this and I normally like to get omega-3s in at this meal, or, maybe it has a higher saturated fat content, or, whatever, right? You can still have some of that in the diet. Now, that's not the case for everyone. Some people need to do like a proper like restrictive diet just to cure their issues and get over their issues. Or, if you have something like celiac disease, like you can't have an 80-20 approach to celiac disease. It's like you just have to get rid of gluten, right? So that is something to be aware of. And it unfortunately means that people, if I say 80-20 or I say 90-10, like people just take that to mean that, oh yeah, that's grand. Like I can have a little bit of stuff every single day or whatever. But I mean, actually like analyze this stuff. Like let's just go from a calorie perspective. You have like 3,000 calories per day to eat. Well, actually use 2,000, if you're on a 90-10 rule, that means you got like whatever, 200 calories, that's all you can eat extra, quote unquote bad, that shouldn't be on thing. I see people going like, oh, I do this like 90-10 approach to, my diet or my nutrition or whatever. And you're like, but you just had like 2,000 calories. Well, not 2,000 if you're on a 2,000 calorie diet, but you had like fucking 1,000 calories of, Ben and Jerry's ice cream there. It's like, that's not 90-10. It's like, you're eating like half your diet is this stuff, So it's like, you do actually have to be honest with yourself if you are going to try to implement some of these thoughts that we've discussed. But anyway, do you have anything else to say, Gary, to kind of wrap that up rather than texting on your phone when you should be entertaining the people that listen to this podcast?
actually keep receiving calls repeatedly that I have to keep hanging up. So apologies. But no, I don't have anything else to add. I think that you should, despite the fact that the goal of this podcast is to deliver the message about fat loss, I would just reinforce that point that what you eat absolutely matters for your health, and your health absolutely matters in the long term. And it certainly matters for your body composition in the long term also. And additionally, if you can develop good habits with a solid base or foundation of quality diet, that is far more likely to stand to you in the long term with your body composition as well. You want to have good food, good habits, and a good relationship with food, and you want to have some sort of dietary structure that you can replicate over time. And that is ultimately what will then become your nature, your norm, and what will contribute to your lifelong body composition. So don't underestimate the role that that basic structure or routine or diet quality plays in your life, because like, again, it actually goes beyond just you as well. Because like, if we think about like the family dynamic, let's say if you are eating a diet that's of good quality and you're cooking for your girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, whatever, and they start to eat healthy as well and they adopt those habits, there's a feed forward effect there where you both impact each other and how you eat in the long term. And then that also, you know, impacts your children and the rest of your family, etc. And that then reinforces your own behavior over time. So if you know, are in a relationship or whatever, and you're going out for eating all the time and you're totally in this IFYM phase of your life and you just eat whatever, then your significant other is going to be doing the same thing, or your friends might be doing the same thing, and that feeds forward as well in a maybe a more negative direction. So yeah, consider the holistic picture, as they say.
1000%. Anyway, Gary, where can people find us? Where can they get in contact?
People can find us at all of the usual spots, guys. If you follow us on Instagram/social media, Triage Method, or Skinny Gaz for myself. Paddy Farrell is the real Paddy Farrell, and Brian is Brian O'Hengasa, all on Instagram. You can also join our Triage Method newsletter or our Facebook group, the Triage Method Community. You can visit our website, triagemethod.com. You'll get information on there about both our coaching service and our education services. So if you're interested in coaching yourself to get to work on your goals, you can find information there or in the description box below. And then if you're a trainer who's interested in your education, you can join the Coach's Corner, information for which is below.
Fantastic. Anyway, I have nothing else to say, so I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week and their life, month, everything. See you later, guys.